Please join me in welcoming Elliot Bostwick Davis.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and everyone who's here, but a very special thanks to Ozzy Dajani, who has made this incredible course possible. And for those of you who don't know, I think last year when we were celebrating our course, our inaugural Dajani course, Dajani's programs course on Mary Cassatt, I did reveal that Ozzy and I also share not only passion for art, but passion for the game of squash. So we are partners in the when we can get on the court. So Ozzy, thank you always for having my back, as you know, and for challenging us all to be able to share a moment about Hans Hofmann today. So I'm very excited about this. So Ozzy, yes, let's have a hand for Ozzy. I think I said last time that we like to win, but we like to win well. That means on great points, and we like to push all these colleagues here in Boston, sometimes those that have like professional jobs on the squash court when we have day jobs. So thank you, Ozzy, and everyone. So I realized that we have shifted to a new subtitle, Art and Inspiration. Thank you, Kristen, was when we published this course, and thanks to Rick, we have on the screen The Balance of Art and Nature, because as I began to think about it, these are both viable themes for the work of Hans Hofmann. And I want to show you a wonderful photograph of him at the time he was working here in this part of the world, and I'm sure there are many people. Are there any actual Hofmann former students of his in the audience? I just thought I would just quickly ask. All right, only because the reason I ended up selecting Hofmann for the Making Modern course, it's the second time in a way he's come my way, but as a teenager, my mother had been an artist, but I studied at the Art Students League of New York, where he had been briefly a teacher, but many of the people who worked with him there had greatly admired him and really enjoyed what he was able to do as a teacher. So I wanted to, with the time we have today, I thought we could use our time in a way to think about, first of all, the Making Modern course and sort of where Hofmann fits in that, but mainly his early biography, the artists he came in contact early on. That's the first segment. The second middle part will be really on those students that he influenced, and I'd like to read for you some of his own philosophy about teaching, because I think it's quite inspirational. And then finally, I wanted to leave you, in addition to looking at his own work, of course, throughout, with a sense of what we can all do when we hit 80, because at the age of 80, he took on a whole new project of mural painting. So that's what we're going to look at the end. So, all right, with that, I just wanted to remind you that Making Modern, here's our Making Modern team. We were on a fast track last year. This is our group, and I think you've heard already from Katie Hansen, who's there in the white dress second from the right, but really a great cross-departmental effort to bring to you the top floor reinvigorated. It tweeted out a bit last summer, thanks to hashtag Matthew Teitelbaum, as you see here ongoing, but really what that floor was presenting to all of you was a sense of this group, and I'm showing the doves in the Central Core Lane Gallery, in a way many of the artists who are core to the Lanes collecting, but also were core to the Alfred Stieglitz circle of artists that are really presented throughout that Central Core. So we were presenting that as what is often thought of as the sort of main or sort of existing early modernist narrative. But up there on this floor, level 3, we were offering you counter-narratives of looking at other kinds of artists. So, for instance, we have here Pollock and Picasso, two giants who never met, and I hope you were able to be in Katie's. I wish I had been in Katie's presentation on these two. But essentially, a dialogue between these two masters, and they very much play into Hofmann's mind as well. Next door, of course, which we're going to be thinking about today, the group that worked around Hans Hofmann. I'm not showing you Hofmann, he's on the opposite wall, but his good colleagues here in the open ochre, Motherwell, and here David Smith and Frankenthaler, who actually was one of his students. Kristen kindly mentioned Dos Meieras, another form of early modernism on that floor, and I'm showing you actually the gallery with the back of Dos Meieras. I'm not sure why I didn't pick the back, but here you see some of her colleagues, because really this was also an interesting circle and collaborative effort with photographers like Tina Modotti, and this man in the center, Carlos Merida, the assistant who worked with her future husband, Diego Rivera, on the murals. Now, I'm showing this slide, but it's actually entirely been reinstalled as of May 15th. So if you haven't been up there lately, definitely go into that gallery. Further broadening and I think offering counter narratives to the story of early modernism is presented in this gallery, this one for Max Beckmann in America. So for instance, you see our former director at the MFA, Perry Rathbone, his wife Rettles here, painted by Max Beckmann, another German emigre, as is Hofmann, whom we're thinking about today, but in dialogue with the artists here in Boston that were, many of them born in the south end of Boston, many of them of German Jewish descent. And there, Jack Levine painting one of the streets in Boston, and around this room you would see other key artists, particularly Beckmann's good friend Carl Zerbe, who emigrated with him to the United States. They were good friends in Germany, showed together, and had an enormous impact here in the United States. But we're here to talk about Hofmann. So here he is again, and now let's give you a little feel for his own trajectory in terms of arriving here as a German-born emigre. He was born in a very small southern Bavarian town. It's there on your handout. It's called Weissenberg. I've never been to it myself. It's down in, it's not even on this map, but it's down in sort of this part of Germany near the southern border. And I think actually it will come in, for those of you, I don't know whether any of you have actually traveled in Bavaria, but I do think that the way that those towns followed basically organic roads, often created by old towns around rivers or cow paths, the way they had been in parts of New England. I think in thinking about the towns that I have visited in Bavaria when I was a graduate student there in the summer of '86, that I do think that piling up of the buildings and that sort of natural way that they formed could have been one of the appeals for Hofmann in Provincetown, and we're going to take a look at some images of that. And I will say that I was really, although Kristen was urging us to create a course around all the different figures, for whatever reason nobody had snatched Hofmann, and I really did snatch him because I did want to visit Provincetown. Having been a student at the Art Students League, I knew that world, but I certainly didn't know the world he taught in Provincetown. So here's a bit of feel for this, what's on the website when you go look at what you get for Weissenberg, Germany. So we're going to be thinking about him in the context of many of his colleagues, and I think very influential for him, although he studied in Munich, as did actually fellow German-born artist Josef Albers, although they didn't study at the exact same school. And I mention Albers because, again, a very influential teacher here in the United States, as many of you know. His wife, Hofmann actually wasn't Jewish, although, of course, many of his students and friends were. And many of the artists associated with the Bauhaus were considered degenerate. So, of course, they had to leave as the Nazis were forcing out all those who were counter to what they thought should be presented as art. Albert's wife was Jewish, so they did come here to the United States, and they taught. Joseph taught for many years at Yale, and had an interesting connect to Latin America as well for us. So I hope one day we may pull out the Albers husband and wife. And I'm here showing from our collection on the left, this you'll find on our website, this dotted weaving by Albers' wife, Ani. We actually have this portion, not this exact necklace, but she was very much interested, as many of the Dada and even the German artists like Schwitters and others who were using found objects, as often in the Bauhaus it was to figure out what you could do with kind of the everyday materials, the basic materials, even paper. And one of my favorite classes I think that Albers taught, and very meaningful when you think of the artist, someone like Henri Matisse, is he taught a course on just creating drawings out of paper. And if you think about that for a moment, he actually challenged his students to take a single sheet of paper and then cut it and figure out a way to create an architectural form out of it. So whether drawing, but in this case, Ani is using what may not be as recognizable to us today, at least it wasn't to me, because we don't have too many sink drains today that look quite like this. But this is a sink drain. It was a simple thing you bought at the hardware store. And it is, she suspended on it these paper clips to create this is in this case, excuse me, a pendant but in our case, in the Frago collection of jewelry, it's actually a brooch. So you can do this yourself. If you go online, you'll find a number of kits that will help you have your own Ani Albers. So I just wanted to give you a feel for the reach of the Bauhaus, and in fact in our own area here in this part of the world. I hope you'll all have a chance to go visit the Walter Gropius house, one of the great masters, very often collaborating with his wife throughout his career, but that's in Lincoln, Mass, and you can see really the principles of the Bauhaus at work in architecture. So it was for all the arts, easel painting among them, and here in our own MFA collection, American-born Lionel Findinger actually went to the Bauhaus to study and then returned. So this is his version of the German church at Erfurt, but shown in the Cubist manner that he was working in, thinking about others looking into abstraction, but thinking about how architecture and painting could be combined. So I was trying to think if I could offer you really these major figures as 20th century teachers. So Albers would certainly be, for me, one of the keys. And the one I think who's often forgotten, and I don't want us to forget about here at the MFA Boston, is this woman. This is Lois Jones. She was Boston born, and this is from our collection. It's up on view on level 3. And I say that because as an African-American woman, when she came to present herself upon graduation to the school of the Museum of Fine Arts, she was told there was no position for her. So she was told she should leave and head south, which she actually did. But she taught for 47 years at Howard University and influenced generations of artists in a way really wasn't fully recognized as a teacher in her own day. So maybe one day we'll think about her and her work as a teacher. But now back to, so we're going to think about these great teachers, Hofmann among them. Back to thinking about Hofmann, as you'll see there on your handout, he trains early on in Bavaria. He makes his way to Paris. So, his family, he has to really make his way in his father's a government official, and so he's able to do that with the help of patrons. I'm showing you here Henri Matisse's murals at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. So you're probably wondering, why is Elliot showing Philadelphia when she's talking about Paris? Well, actually, by this point, Matisse was in the United States working on these murals with Barnes for his museum, although this is I took off the web, so it's in the new museum that's been moved to Central Philadelphia, but that's an exact replica of the murals that were at Marion, where he had originally painted them. So it's believed that Hofmann and Matisse reconnected, although they had connected early on in those early years in Paris. So in those years in Paris, Hofmann is quite taken, as so many artists were, by the work of Paul Cezanne. Just one of the incredible giants. I'm showing you two works, the upper left in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I think if you were to consider for a moment the kinds of, the ways that Cezanne is using brushstrokes, when we get to our images of Hofmann and we think about what he's talking to us about, what he calls the push and pull of color, space, and form, very much in this way that Cezanne is constructing his landscapes with discrete brushstrokes, whether they are in the foreground these ochre colors of southern France, or the way that he's creating trees to build up with individual strokes the structure. And as you see here, the mountain, and again, Mont Saint-Victoire, just like George O'Keeffe, he's going to paint this mountain shape again and again and again, something that Hofmann's going to do as well when he sets up a still life for himself. And yet, when you think about the contour of this mountain, you'll see that Cezanne hasn't quite, this one's a little bit blurry, I'm sorry, if you go online you'll find some others, but you'll see that this contour isn't exactly precise. And that's owing to the fact that Cezanne is really thinking about how vision and how our perception of color and form in the distance is relative, and how it's coming through the artist's own personality. And so in a way, he's not going to give you an exact, he's going to give you an approximation of this experience of the landscape of Mont Saint-Victoire. So again, think about the lessons of Cezanne as we think about the implications of Hofmann. He was also, of course, an exact contemporary of Picasso. So Matisse, these are all artists born around 1880, as was Hans Hofmann, and I think Hans Hofmann has such a long career into the 20th century, often forget that he's actually born 20 years before 1900. So Picasso, he becomes quite fascinated, of course, by Picasso and Braque and their explorations of form and space relative to Cubism. And this was a slide I had shown earlier when this work is ours at the MFA. This is as well as these two, but they are not in the gallery anymore, but perhaps I hope you heard about them from Katie Hansen. Now, I think what very different in our case with Hofmann is his love of color. So while in Paris, he also became engaged with the work of these two, husband and wife, Robert at the left and Sonia Delaunay. And these artists are all working on abstraction in a variety of ways, and I think they all stem from not just Cezanne, but this figure, Wassily Kandinsky. And we don't, unfortunately, have any Kandinskys we can show you at the MFA Boston, but we do know, while we don't know whether Hofmann and Kandinsky actually met, early on, this one's from 1914, Kandinsky, like Hofmann and like many of these early modernists, very interested in writing about and sort of working their ideas out on paper. And so Kandinsky wrote several important works. One of them is From Point to Line to Plane in 1915. And the other one that is really critical would be that one of On the Spiritual in Art. And again, while Hofmann takes on later on in some of his writings the relationship of the arts and architecture as far as Kandinsky is concerned, I would say that probably more of a trajectory, and the reason for his engagement with that was probably that he was quite influenced by the kinds of thinking that Kandinsky was trying to work out in paintings like this one, watercolor and pencil. So now, to go back to thinking about, these are someone working with the spiritual, sort of the kinds of forms that are being generated that have some relationship to nature, very different from how someone like Albers, this one from our collection, Gay Desert, how he's creating a sense of the natural world using very geometric shapes and colors and forms that play off of one another. But yet, when we, again, look at Hofmann, I think what's fascinating about Hofmann, and he's an artist that is fortunately due for a great deal more work and reevaluation, is that when you think about his rectangles, and here we have Albers placing rectangles within rectangles within rectangles. This was actually, we know from his writings, based on some doorways that he experienced while visiting the Southwest, particularly New Mexico. So think about these kinds of doorways, and think about when you go up to making modern, the O'Keeffe kinds of doorways in her own patio at her home in Abiquiu. And again, she was living out there at that time, but look at how Albers is using just the variation of rectangles and color to suggest the architecture of those doorways. And it really does work as you start looking at color as a means of achieving space through form. Now, many people probably wouldn't think of how much he admired Mondrian, although he really did. And I think, again, it's tremendously fascinating to me that he would have connected with the Dutch constructivist, and slightly different take than the Bauhaus, the German Bauhaus artists. But in New York in the 40s, where he would have been certainly well known. He would have known Mondrian's work, and he does say he felt that Mondrian was one of his great inspirations. I just want to remind you of his interest in Cubism, and now let's bring you into some of his work finally. So here he is painting the Green Bottle in 1921, this one from the Lane collection. And as we rethink making modern, in fact, probably by December, I think we're going to be introducing more of these Hofmanns in our own collection as sort of, maybe we'll take him full-blown, a bit more than just a single painting. So we've been thinking about him in Paris, and soon after marries Maria Mitz, and I want to show you his portrait of Mitz in 1901, and so he's at age 21. She became his wife, and apparently much beloved and he, after she died, he did have very briefly before he died a wife, a second wife, as you see there, Renate Smith. But apparently all the people who knew Mitz just adored her. And I show you this because, again, very much a combination of, in 1901, if you think of some of Picasso's work or the Italian Impressionists who were known as the Macchiaioli, but especially artists that he admired like Matisse. And because we have the season of Matisse right here at the MFA Boston, I think these two you can look at, and you can look at a number of Matisse's firsthand in the Gunn Gallery. But this not on view, but the groundbreaking portrait of his wife, Matisse's wife, Madame Matisse, the green line or the green stripe as it's known, for this color that was considered just way too provocative at the time, dividing her face. And to us today, I think we hardly even see it. So again, we have to put ourselves back into the mode of 1905 and sort of thinking about how these artists appeared as les fauves, the wild beasts at the time. So he was rejected from service in the war. He, of course, has to be one step ahead of those who are going to make, the Nazis certainly are going to not find his art to be of the type that they find worthy of supporting in Germany. So he eventually comes to the United States early on in 1930. And there are not that many drawings that really survive of this period, as you can imagine, but he's a consummate draftsman. It's fascinating to watch Hofmann draw throughout his career, because in a way for him, the drawings are never studies for the paintings. They're a means in and of themselves for sort of furthering his own artistic vision. And I also do want to highlight for all of you who may be on the road this summer that the Portland Museum of Art this June will be opening up a wonderful show of Hofmann work on paper that I happened to have a chance to see when I was in Jacksonville, Florida earlier this year. It was there, and it had been curated by the curators at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Jacksonville, and I happened to note that it was coming to Portland. So again, I'm thrilled to see these sorts of work which are less well known. But so what are we going to bear in mind as we think about these early experiences with the industrial landscape, which attracted him at that period in his career? He's, as you see, painting the oil fields out in California, but look at this way that he's repeating these swirls. They almost look like doodles, and I think doodles are the right term in a sense, because he's trying to get at the intuitive, he's trying to get at his own subconscious through drawing. Now I'm going to move ahead to a different kind of drawing, one of his reclining figures from his own life classes. He was engaged with the figure really throughout his career. You see that this one it was part of the Addison's collection. And it's important to note that this region of New England was very good to Hofmann in the sense that the Addison early on in 1948 mounted an exhibition of his work. His first work shown in the United States was 1944 at Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century Gallery. And, again, it's not what we think of as kind of a traditional artist painting the figure. It's much more about the figure in relation to the space, almost the figure as still life within the space. And we're going to see this one again, but I just wanted to put it out there for you. So, of course, life drawing was very much a part of the Art Students League, where he initially went. And in New York City, after visiting California, he goes back to Europe and eventually, he teaches out at UC Berkeley. He comes back to the United States. He comes to New York City, teaches briefly at the League, and meets up with a number of colleagues who are going to be kind of colleagues for life, including Arshile Gorky and none other than Mark Rothko. And this is Robert Motherwell and another Rothko on the right. So all, and as well, of course, Pollock there from our own Pollock Picasso. And there you see number 10 from 1950. So these are all good colleagues in that core of his group in New York City. And as I said, he teaches briefly at the League, but then he realizes he's going to create his own school for himself in New York City, but he still has a great deal of influence with all of these good colleagues. And in the summers, as so many artists did, they felt, in those days there wasn't a lot of air conditioning, Manhattan's hot, and so getting out of the city was to a place where they could all collaborate and be colleagues was a way to really rejuvenate their work. So Provincetown became the place of choice for Hofmann and many others. And I just wanted to remind you that others had been there from the later 19th century or in the earlier 20th. This is in our collection, in the Lane collection. It actually was only recently identified as Provincetown, and it's funny, when I set foot on the main street where I was meeting with Elaine McCarthy, who was terrific, the president of the Provincetown Association Art Museum there, it became very clear to me as well that this scene, while it's called Down the Hill, was clearly on that little main street beside the ocean in Provincetown. So it was our colleague Amanda Burden who used this in a show that's touring right now at the High Museum for a show she called Rural Modern that actually nailed it down in looking at our files as Provincetown. So I wanted to just set the stage for you. But I think what you see here is how Niall Spencer is also responding to these cheek-by-jowl sort of fishing village cottages that are connected to one another in these abstract shapes and this road in between. And it turns out that that's what the artist Motherwell included, and I'm sorry I didn't bring any of the quotes along, but they really loved about the community was that they could be active in their studios, but they could actually sit on the front porch and kind of watch the world go by, and depending on where they chose their place of residence. Of course, it had for artists a lot of affordable housing at that time, and that was key. Great scenery, also key, but importantly, the colleagues and that sense of bumping into your colleagues regularly and kind of organically and naturally. So I wanted to just set the stage a bit for you with one of our artists in the collection. But remind you that Bostonians like Charles Hawthorne, who worked, well, I guess we're going to claim him as a Bostonian, but he worked primarily in the North Shore, but also out in Provincetown. This is our painting by Hawthorne named The Bowl. He was already out there teaching groups of artists as I was thinking he's our northern counterpart, perhaps, to someone like William Merritt Chase. So I hope you all had a chance to delve into our excellent and beautiful William Merritt Chase show that my good colleague Erica Hirschler had created. And she's over there in Venice right now with the MFA patrons. It's over in Venice. So in any event, Hawthorne and Chase teaching plein air, teaching out on in Provincetown. This, of course, is an indoor scene with a model. May have been, who knows, a rainy day or just a model scene. But he did go out and offer critiques right there on the wharf. And you know, the group that was working with Hawthorne is, I think, quite varied and unusual. So people is ranging from N.C. Wyeth, there you see at the left, not in our collection as well, and this one on the right, which is in our collection, Polly Thayer, went out and worked in Provincetown. This is her cabbages, and so here you have Hawthorne. And I hope many of you may know this artist, Blanche Lascelles. She also was working, as you see here, in Provincetown in the 30s before, just as Hofmann was getting there. As soon as he came to New York, he more or less chose a summer spot out in Provincetown, these prints. And here you have him actually in a couple of the scenes with his many students. So he taught regularly there, and he had a routine that he generally loved to follow there, which was he would set up in the mornings, nude model drawing from the nude, and this is Blanche Lascelles drawing from the nude in the Hofmann class out at the, as you see at the, it's all the way in West Virginia. But what you see here, because at the time when Hofmann was working with her in 1937, he didn't yet have fluent English. And so what would happen is he would make these marks as to what he was indicating as plus or minus, so do more, do less. And then she would follow, for the moment, we don't even really know. I mean, we'd have to have been in the class to understand exactly what they were after, but the fact that he's really attempting to help her and all of the students, and this was quite common. I mean, Beckmann came to the U.S. with very little English. Albers himself came with little English, and so did Hofmann, but he clearly mastered it because he was able to write a great deal about it. But again, as you look at these drawings and you think about the influence of someone like Hofmann on these artists, he's very interested in not the specifics of the figure, every single muscle, bone, or tendon. He's really thinking about how does this form relate to the space around it. So he's thinking about the darks and the lights, the solidity of this particular figure, and it apparently, and this was told by many students, if he didn't think it was working out, he would often just tear the sheet in half and have people work on it in a different way to force that kind of thinking. But here I wanted to bring you the more traditional kinds of, this is done from a plaster cast, but this is Lois Jones in the 20s working as a teenager. I happen to have this slide in my office, which is why I brought it for you today. But just to remind you of the kind of way that people were thinking about, this is from cast, but life drawing as a skill for artists being much more about rendering the whole weight of the figure as opposed to the figure in space. So again, she was quite young. She was born in 1905, so she's really about 18 here when she's working on this. So if you go out to the Provincetown Association Art Museum, you'll find some wonderful small publications on Hofmann and his students out there. And thanks to my colleagues, and especially their director, I was able to use some of these images, and as you can see, well, this one actually is at the museum, and Hofmann was quite open to having many female students, and he did have obviously a great rapport with many of them, so it was very positive for them. So this is Lillian Orlowski, who did leave a number of things to the museum, and again, very different from the one we just saw, but you see her here, her isolating a shape within the composition and looking at these strong dynamic lines that for her really are the primary lines that she's capturing of this particular seated nude on a box here. And I think that's really what they're after. So again, this one didn't come with the commentary by Hofmann, but she clearly lived out there and took a number of his classes. Here's a different approach by Stephen Pace. Again, very much about the light and the dark. And Hofmann would say when he was setting up still lives, and we'll look at those in a moment, that it was just as important to think about the space between the objects that you're setting up for yourself, and to really be thinking about how those appear in your composition. So when you look at this arm that he has created in this particular work with pen and ink, it's that he's leaving aside that sheet of paper and blocking in the black to create a sense of that. And of course, it doesn't quite connect with the form there, but on the other hand, it definitely gives you that feeling of the figure reaching or placing his hand, her hand on something sort of resting in the pose. But it's much more about an exploration and consideration of these two forms in space using light and dark. Now, this really is Robert De Niro, the actor. Yes, I thought I would just state that right up front. He did take classes out there at the Provincetown Art Association. When we were teenagers at the League, we frequently had so-called VIPs come into our class, although they looked like all of us, covered with charcoal. So in our day, it was Peter Falk was there quite a bit. And of course, I only knew him as Columbo, but in the class, he was just anybody else. So here's Robert De Niro. Again, I love the fact that he's doing this very beefy guy in the class with these very large hands, and yet you see him working out, again, the architecture of this particular man's physique as it builds up through these dynamic lines, and then working on the lights and darks. So I actually think he did it. What would you think about his drawing? I give him a good grade for this drawing. I think he looks like he did certainly pay attention to a number of Hofmann's lessons. Now, another artist that you probably don't really think about and associate with Hofmann is this artist, Larry Rivers. He's usually thought of in more of a pop context. This one happens to be from our collection in the Blake Purnell collection. But again, as I think you begin to think about this in the context of Hofmann, you see that these two figures, he's really placing them in this situation. He's calling them bedroom. So again, by virtue of his title, he's placing him in that context. And almost anywhere you look at all of this unfinished sense over here behind the man, and what's happening with the light and the dark and how space is being used there. So again, once I think you start seeing Hofmann and you start seeing these students, I think what's fascinating is to begin to see what piece of Hofmann did they push in their own work. And again, interesting details, look at these shoes, or what's even going on with this rug here. Parts of it are, well realized. And again, he's normally thought of as sort of our pop art one of our quintessential pop art. Look at he's leaving a whole lot left open here around this detail of this Near Eastern carpet, but we don't really know, to what end, except that exploring the sense of pattern and form and color relative to space. And I love the fact that, again, these details of looking through doorways past this room where these two are posed, very old kind of trope, goes back to the 17th century Old Master Dutch painters, Vermeer and many others, de Hoek, and you can go up in our 17th century galleries upstairs and take a look at a number of those. And yet, in this case, think back even to what we looked at already this morning with the Albers Gay Desert, the doorways of how someone like Albers is stacking up color and form to create that sense of deeper space into the picture plane. And that's something that Hofmann's going to do as well. So mornings were for the nude. I did want to just take let's just go back to one of Hofmann's students and just say, I wanted to give you just a few quotes of his about his thinking about teaching, because I think it's quite interesting. He first of all says that, and he wrote on your handout, I think I gave you a number of the actual resources. The bulk of his collection went to the University of California at Berkeley. That's where he had first been, and he did leave a number of his things there, but many of them are online, so you can find them. And I'm just going to quote first. So here's one of his statements that I think is very apt. He said, "About myself, my work, my school, I never considered myself the founder of any particular school. I would consider it a limitation in a world of inexhaustible creative possibilities." And then he says, "I'm not a teacher in the usual sense either. I'm a painter who had to teach," he says actually which had to teach, but who had to teach for his livelihood to assume artistic independence. In the function, I became the imitator and disseminator of certain creative ideas that have contributed to the cultural evolution of our time. And he says, "I enjoy the wrong reputation that I love to teach. What I really love is the function as a teacher, is the steady contact with new possibilities in the future of a new generation." But he goes on to say, and he says, he has this sort of, I think, in the way he describes the push-pull of space, he has this sort of love-hate, and he even says that with teaching. But here are some of his principles. First, I handle every student from the beginning as the individual he or she really is. Two, by establishing what is in the man or the woman, his very own, I cultivate instincts, and I keep them alive in the spark that must inflame his entire artistic future. And as a teacher, and this is the one I find most really revelatory of the great heart that he had, he says, I respect the smallest talent. A pearl is a pearl, great or small. A talent is a talent, great or small. The sum total of it makes the cultural assessment of a nation. So again, I don't know if I hope we have some teachers out there in our audience, but I do love that sense that every student can obviously teach us something, and I love that feeling of a pearl is a pearl. So again, he talks about it being very hard. He says here on April 1st, April Fool's Day 1950, he says on teaching is extremely strenuous. It requires continued concentration from one work to another, one individual to another. It sidetracks every artist. It forces him into the explanation of the inexplicable, the explanation being only the work, or the showing of the step-by-step development from one quality into another. I may paint 10 hours without rest or food and still feel less exhausted from teaching only a relatively short time. I do like it, and I do not like it. I would miss it, and I still would like to miss it. So he clearly had this just great heart, and that's what you hear again and again and again from his students, how much he gave to them, how I think in that sense of placing himself, this sort of that humility that Hofmann has, is finding everyone there, and those continued creative possibilities. So that's what I truly find incredibly inspirational and exciting. So we've seen these. So now let's move on to the second half. If we were all lucky enough to be out there in Provincetown in the 30s or 40s, or he continued to teach well into the 50s. In the afternoon, he set up a still life. So this is just one of his own at the Metropolitan Museum from the 1940s. And it's a bit hard to make out. So think back to that early California oil field of I'd call them doodles, and how those circular forms were working. And I forgot to put on your handout, and I'm sorry I forgot to add it, but I highly recommend, I hope you can see it in the light here, Elaine de Kooning's, these are the compilation, The Spirit of Abstract Expressionism, Selected Writing. She was a student of his, but also in this book, because she was an artist, many artists welcomed her into their studios, and she wrote about their painting a picture. And it's fascinating because in a way it's firsthand, beautifully written. She's a beautiful writer, talented writer. She wrote these initially she began as a way to make money so that before she took off as an artist, she could actually have a way to support herself for Art News. But they're compiled, and I just highly recommend this because when she talks about Hofmann, and she goes through really all kinds of artists in here, we did use some of her quotes for the Making Modern labels upstairs, but she talks about him setting up a still life that she's then going to watch him paint. And she talks about the fact that, in a way, he's working his way towards something he may not know exactly what. And by that, he means himself that he's working in a very intuitive manner. So from Elaine de Kooning, and again, we have this one, so I'm just going to show you this one from the Lane Collection 21, looking at it in relation to the still lives, this sort of cubist still lives of Picasso. But here's what she writes, quote, and this is Hofmann talking to her, "An artist must look to nature for the essence of space, but appearance must be thoroughly understood. Space was never a static, inert thing, but alive, and its life can be felt in the rhythm in which everything in a visual ensemble exists." Now, she says, in watching him, Hofmann can, in arranging a still life, present an object not in terms of its own shape, but as a space maker. And that's her quotes, but his quote, a space maker. Thus, in a still life, a white bowl, 3 apples, an ashtray, a small pitcher, and a jar of show card color lose their conventional solidity as the distance between them, activated here, and we don't have an image, unfortunately, of what he painted, but activated here by a backdrop of silver wrapping paper and the shaft of cellophane in the vase, become more prominent and suggestive than the objects themselves. The work in progress wasn't named until Hofmann had made a series and discovered at last that the fruit bowl, radically changing its form from one version to another, seemed to be the dramatic center in each. And so then he goes back and maybe names the series Fruit Bowl 1, Fruit Bowl 2, and so on. So again, and I think he's very interested in these shapes between. Here he's stacking up the glass in front of this bottle, and it's early, so we don't have the perfect one to use, but I think you can still see him thinking through the spaces between, let's say, whatever's going along on this patterned tablecloth, let's say, with the maybe background of the window, perhaps, where he's posing this particular still life. So again, he's thinking about those artists he greatly admired, like Picasso, in works like this that he would have seen early on in Paris. But here's what his students are working on. And this one, again, from the Provincetown Association Art Museum, where he has set up a number of things on a box for the students to portray. And you see them constantly pulling out these dynamic angles of form as a means of finding their way in sort of the most important principles of each of the still life. And just to say that I think the similar thing is going on when you think of some of these nudes as though they are still lives, which I've mentioned before. All right, so now let's take a look at some of those artists that he did influence. So we have Louise Nevelson. I know, very hard to see here. This is a very, as you see, graphite, but it's more like a Matisse, simple outline here. And here she is. I find this one fascinating. This is in our collection where she's working on a monotype, which is usually done on a smooth surface. You ink the plate and then you might scratch into it. It almost has a pictogram or an ancient, it looks like it could be from whether ancient Native Americas or ancient Americas kinds of graphic, but very experimental. There from the 1950s. And just to go back to those kinds of looping shapes that Hofmann was using in his still lifes, but I think what really this sort of work and the deep darks of these, the way he's showing this particular still life study to me have a great deal of to say in terms of how Nevelson is playing with her black constructions. This one from our collection, Miro Shadow 8, which is quite large, almost as large as you see there on the screen. And again, when we could have put these side by side, but if you think about where Hofmann is using the white of the paper and the dark of the ink, and think about how Louise Nevelson is choosing to work entirely in black relative to the deeper space as she builds up these compositions with found objects, whether sometimes you see parts of instruments or turned pieces of wood or sometimes curves that she's using, French curves that or just found objects that she's putting together. So the other, a number of people who wrote about Hofmann, I want to go from dark to light. This is one of his joyous sort of responses to Provincetown Harbor, this one as you see nearby at Phillips, the Addison Gallery. And apparently he just loved painting Provincetown Harbor again and again and again. And I think, again, being there in the summer and being able to have the continual view onto the harbor and look at how he's pulling out, dynamic lines and colors and shapes. Are these, inspired by sailboats or parts of, what is happening in the with the buildings perhaps, or people with, maybe it's beach towels. I mean, who knows how he's been inspired. But he said his students said he particularly loved portraying it when it was stormy. And he loved capturing the churned up water from that view of Provincetown Harbor. So this one looks to me more of like a summer day, but really interesting how he's using the primaries, red, yellow, and blue, with that underdrawing that we've been seeing now up until this point, mostly without color. So to remind you, of course, he did, Blanche Lascelles, as you heard, was in his class using lots of color in a number of her woodblocks, and I hope some of you had a chance to see the excellent exhibition here in 2004 of Blanche Lascelles' color woodblocks. It's really one of the catalog, I'm sure, is still available, but these two, for instance, would have been in there, and both of these inspired by Provincetown. But perhaps less well known to you may be this artist, Irene Rice de Pereira. We'd love to get her work into the MFA's collection. She's a very interesting artist in that she tended, well, these are two different modes of how she worked. Here you see her, perhaps she was in, obviously, Hofmann's class. That's why all these artists I'll be showing you had set foot in his classes. Others, I had a question as we were assembling today about others who may not have been in class, but certainly were out there. And visitors to his to Provincetown included Mark Rothko, Gottlieb, Pollock, and others who liked the community, and Motherwell, of course, being part of it as well. So those artists were not formally part of the classes, but certainly part of the community. So here's Irene Rice de Pereira showing us these fishing boats, not usually the way we think of her work, much more constructivist, and yet this one, you see her, she often creates works with plexiglass, the way Charles Sheeler, and I think maybe Leila Bermea, our colleague in Art of the Americas, talked to you a bit about Sheeler's work last week on plexiglass, but she too was fascinated by the availability of new kinds of media. This was one I could just show you today, but I think you see some of this watery nature of these shapes that she's applying to the composition in 61. This could be an horizon inspired by her work in Provincetown or being near the ocean, but yet she's making something very different with this kind of a construct. She often used masking tape, all kinds of things to create these kinds of constructs. So very different, I think, than what you might expect coming out of perhaps Hofmann's class, and yet when we think of Hofmann's great love of people like Mondrian and his admiration for people like Albers and those in the Bauhaus, not so surprising. Now, I want to just remind you and interject as we go along, Hofmann himself. So here he is working in a two-sided work, and we'll be thinking about how to show this one in our galleries. We generally show it one side at a time, but you see that one from 1944 called Integration on one side and Untitled. Of course, it's also a practicality for many artists. Double-sided, it spares your materials when materials, and he was just at 1944 having his first show at Art of the Century, but he didn't quite yet have the following, so hence, as he said, why he was teaching. But I wanted to read you in relation to these two images, because I do think it's underpinning to them. And he says, "At the time of making a picture, I want not to know what I'm doing. A picture should be made with feeling, not with knowing. The possibilities of the medium must be sensed. Anything can serve as a medium. Kerosene, benzene, turpentine, linseed oil, beeswax, even beer." He paints on heavy duck, he says, as opposed to linen, because he finds that to be most responsive to his own pigments. And he also loves to prime those with a very flat white or gesso. And again, this is all written in Elaine de Kooning's description of what he thinks of as a medium, but I think we use that quote up on the wall because I think most people walking into the gallery wouldn't think of his using perhaps beer as a medium. But he definitely had all kinds of things at his hand. He said that why bother using the limitations of a brush? That's far too limiting. I'm going to use whatever it is I need to put paint on to my canvas. But he is thinking about that way to tap into his intuition, his inner sensibility. And I brought along, André Masson should have an accent there, but the automatic drawings of the surrealists of this period, a little bit earlier here, 24, but continue throughout into the 30s, 40s, because he is in a way Hofmann is looking at a way as to how to combine that with all these other threads. And I think that's what in the end makes him such an incredible master and a fascinating artist, that he's working through and continues to work through, as we've seen, Picasso, Matisse, the Delaunay's in terms of color, and then all of this automatic types of drawing. So also in our collection, I find this one also fascinating from the 40s. It's called Embrace. But at the time, and I think I was once talking with Matthew, so we could do a very interesting show, just a cross-cut of the collection in 1947, because it's just far enough after the war that people are getting back on their feet in the post-war period. This one was very much inspired by the different availability of looking at subatomic particles. So Hofmann writes about these two intertwined shapes, and you've seen lots of Hofmann shapes already this morning, but he said these were inspired by his looking through a microscope at amoeba that were separating or joining, however you want to think about it. And I wanted you to think about this work. This one is in our collection, but not on view right now because it's constantly in demand for touring exhibitions. This one by Norman Lewis, Every Atom Glows, Electrons and Luminous Vibration. And what Lewis has done with a black and white, and you've seen how many of these artists are really working actively in black and white, but he had actually attended the Oppenheim lectures at Princeton on subatomic particles, and he decided that the way he could represent that as an artist in terms of the power that these people were thinking of unleashing is he painted rather strands of paint. They almost look like I think of them as sort of underwater plants. And then what you see crossing them, that luminous vibration, that's actually his thumbprint being dragged across the black paint. So he's leaving his own signature everywhere in this composition, his own mark as an artist, and yet he's creating something that speaks to what he feels the cosmos. So they are thinking about the very small heading into, representing the incredibly large and cosmic. So let's look at a few more Hofmann compositions. I love this one because when you think about his limitations of using the brush, you can really feel him working into this picture. And he was a very physical painter, as all of his students said. So this one I wanted to show you in the Lane collection. This one, not in our collection, but this one was in the recent show at Portland. I'm not sure if it'll be traveling with the show. But again, he's named this one Flowering Desert. And you heard earlier that I had retitled this The Balance of Art and Nature. So it would be tough for us to perhaps point to the flowering desert, but I think you can feel that he's responding to the brilliant colors of the desert. And I just want to remind you that, this is the flip side of what we began with, thinking of Albers representing the gay desert, but again with these intense colors. And if you want to try this out up on level 3, go over and look at the intense colors of the Southwest that O'Keeffe is using as well when she's thinking about this brilliant light with these intense colors. And I'm sorry I'm showing you these two, and I think actually the Red Tree, Yellow Sky has gone off to an MFA project, so you'll see something else up there instead. And Twilight, again, he's going to name some of these compositions. As this one, this was one of the earliest to come into the collection, thanks to Lois and late Hank Foster. And I do think you feel for his way of working with pigment, and even as far back as when we began with the image of Cezanne, of those discrete touches of pigment in Cezanne's landscapes. Here you see Twilight built up with reds, greens, and then perhaps a sense of this sun. And as another excellent writing on Hofmann that I don't believe I put on your handout is by Barbara Rose in this small little work on Hofmann drawings. I'm just going to hold it up so you know it. And she mentions, and I think quite appropriately, that Hofmann never quite leaves, as neither does Picasso or the Cubists, the sense of representation. Even though he's calling this one Twilight, we do have a sense of where the sky, perhaps the sun, and the earth of the green in this composition. This is really the stunner we have up there in on level 3, thanks to some very generous local collectors. And what better way to see his example of the push and pull of color, as he later called it. And I just want to read you from him what he felt. And again, he's really the best one to think about, to write about his own work. So here's what he talks about Hofmann in terms of the pictorial function of colors. And I quote, every color's shade suggests volume. Volume is depth. Depth is a dimension. Two colors seen simultaneously not only suggest color volume inherent in each of them, but provide, in the form of a relation, the further possibility of pictorial expansion or contraction. And then he goes on to say, when these forces are made to work in the sense of push and pull, pictorial vitality will result. Only on the basis of this quality, as far as color is concerned, is it possible to suggest, on a two-dimensional picture surface, a vital third dimension without destroying the two-dimensionality of the picture surface. So again, as you hear him thinking, writing and wanting to articulate what he's after in his work, think about how that green rectangle functions on the orange. Of course, again, we could unpack this if we have any neuroscience or people interested in the science of vision here. He's specifically putting the green on the orange for that optical effect, because you know that I should have brought along Jasper Johns' flag. He did the exact same combination. If you look at orange and green together, they will translate, as Johns did, into the red, white, and blue of the American flag. So again, very skilled, but done through a very deliberate way of working with the composition. And he's calling this one, color and form, he's calling this one Autumnal Glory, the Swamp Series. So I think, as you know, if we tested this out, when you look away, you're going to get even more brilliant after effects as you would in looking at the real forms in nature. So this is what he's after, and again, stemming all the way back to his work his thinking and his experience early on with Cezanne. But let's go through a few more of his students, and then I do want to give you a little bit of his touch and inspiration for all of us as we hit, if we're lucky enough to hit 80, what we might be doing then. All right, so in our collection, Helen Frankenthaler, and it's called Dawn After the Storm. I mean, to me, when you hear about how interested Hofmann was in portraying the sea around Provincetown, she was one of his students. To me, you can't but feel that Hofmann's sense of turbulence in this oil and alkyd on canvas. Here is Lee Krasner, and I think when you saw that earlier still life, you might have felt some of that swirling sense of form, or even back as far as his drawings from 1930. Here's Hofmann, and here's Hofmann again. Also in his classes, Joan Mitchell, this one from our collection, Chamonix, and again, a landscape shown very abstractly, and yet with her own particular voice. And I think that's what's really special about these artists, is that you see, if we even want to link it back or see a thread of Hofmann through, we still see it through the personality of each one of these artists. Here she is, Elaine de Kooning, this one from our collection, and others that I'm sure you all know as well. Again, how this one is later work, but figurative work based on mythology, Bacchus. Now, many artists who came through the classes with Hofmann, because he was part of the American Abstract Artist Group in New York City, were working in other modes, such as Carl Holty. And remember, this is Hofmann's open-mindedness to constructivists like Mondrian, but these artists were very committed to geometric forms of abstraction. So here's Holty, not in our collection here. Here's another artist who worked with him working with collage, which I think is also interesting, how many artists would sort of pick up whatever they had to work with and create images, as would even Larry Rivers here in this one about Stravinsky. And they even, in the group of artists that worked with him, were very comfortable experimenting with printmaking. Here's Mary Frank and her print of horses, this one a monotype. We saw the earlier monotype by Louise Nevelson. But here's also Hofmann working with a screen print and something more opaque, and yet going back in to add pigment on top. So here he is, 1949. He is now, at this age, he's 69. And his dealer in New York City, a man named Samuel Kuntz, is going to propose to him that he think about a whole new project, and that is creating a series of murals in collaboration with an architect named Jose Luis Sert. And they're going to be, he was the man who had actually designed the Spanish pavilion where Picasso's Guernica had hung in 1937. So again, very meaningful for Hofmann to be collaborating with him. And yet he is going to take on a series of images for the Peruvian city of, based on the Peruvian city of Chimbote. And so this is something at, 79, this is what he's gonna experiment with. Well, now, for all of us here, murals, and I think particularly interestingly, we tend to forget about the mid-century muralists working very actively in this form. But, of course, we know here at the MFA Boston, artists always considered murals to be the final sort of capstone of their career. So here's Sargent in our own upper rotunda. Of course, Benton, many, many murals in that period of the 30s and 40s, Benton also being the teacher of Jackson Pollock, who painted these very large-scale murals, and one of his first and most important for Peggy Guggenheim's apartment in New York City, so certainly known to Hofmann. We've talked and already seen the Matisse murals here in the United States at the Barnes, but members of his own circle were creating mural-sized compositions. And again, I'm thinking a bit about this a fair amount, because we're going to host here at the MFA Boston in September a group of 11 Rothkos from the National Gallery, and they'll be on view upstairs in the Lindy family wing. So this is Rothko's chapel in Houston, where he's thinking about these works in series as it would surround, and you see the benches there. And even later, this one, which I actually haven't seen in person, but as I was preparing this, I do want to go over and see it. This one from 1963 here in the Boston area at Tufts, created by Motherwell, Hofmann's close friend and contemporary. And this one was a collaboration between the government service administrator Bernard Boutin and the Art and Architecture program. And it was called New England Elegy. It is called, from 1966. But it was considered to be too raw at the time the period following the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And since we're celebrating this year the 100th anniversary this weekend, as a matter of fact, of Kennedy's birth, I thought I would just mention that many of Hofmann's colleagues and contemporaries were actively engaged in this collaboration of architecture and mural painting. But let's take a look. So here he is at the age of 79, working on this series for Chimbote. And they were shown in an exhibition that I unfortunately didn't have a chance to see, but I think it's fascinating that he was thinking about, these were going to be enormous murals. In fact, they ended up scaling down the bell tower that was going to be, let's see, the mural was going to be, let's see, do I have the full, oh yes, it was going to be 50 by 24 feet. And the bell tower eventually scaled down was 8 by 24 feet, just to give you an idea of how large. So these three here, three more, and finally 3 more. Well, now, Hofmann didn't stop at there, living in New York as he was still during his lifetime. These are 2 that survive. I don't know whether you know them. I certainly didn't know them, but I'm going to go take a look at them. If we're lucky enough to get into 711 3rd Avenue, he wrapped with mosaic this elevator bank, and he produced, in this case, the for the High School of Graphic Art in Manhattan, and I was just looking to see if I could get you the full. This one is actually 64 feet long and 11 feet tall, and it's executed in mosaics, glass tiles, that give you a feel for his sense of color and sort of his natural sense of his sort of graphic brushstroke. And this one on West 49th Street. So I hope all of you, if nothing else, we can have us all say that we're going to take a field trip and at least get an eye on some of these Hofmanns that are part of the cityscape. So with those 2, I wanted, again, his great love for Mondrian. If you think of these later works, and I just wanted to give you a sense of his trajectory, here he is really working in much more of a Mondrian-esque, if you will, style, creating Cathedral in '59. And again, I think he's thinking about all this work he did for Chimbote. And here he is in Combinable Wall of 1961, there at Berkeley as a gift of Hans Hofmann. So with that, I think we will open it up to questions, which I hope I'll be able to answer. I hope now you'll go up to the 3rd floor of Making Modern and see that we've only suggested a really one window into the work of Hans Hofmann, and I do hope we'll all have just great appreciation and derive great inspiration from this incredible master who is also, I think, an incredible giver as a teacher. So with that, I thank you for being a great audience, and I welcome your questions. Anyone out there? Yes, right up here.
This seems like a good time to...
Oh, thank you for coming. Oh, sorry, we had someone in front. Sorry, yeah, that's all right. He was starting. Can we just hold your question for just a moment? Please, thank you.
This seems like a good time to talk about the relationship between Matisse and Hans Hofmann.
Yes.
And when I look at some of his color-filled work like this, it reminds me of Matisse's colors, his painting.
Yeah.
And the question that comes to mind is whether or not there are relations between his use of color and value with Matisse's use of color and value.
Oh yes, I think very much so. I probably, if we could have researched more thoroughly, it'd be really worth doing a deep dive into exactly what he was seeing in Paris. What kinds of Matisse were on view publicly at the time he was there, because he was there at the time Matisse was making those really revolutionary works. So I think if we put more than just Madame Matisse, as you saw earlier on, in juxtaposition with his wife's portrait, of course, coming out of a very different sort of mode, I think you would see this happening again and again. And of course, he's engaged with Matisse in the 30s. So that would be the other way to test when he's meeting up with Matisse doing the murals for the barns. And again, it would just require more of a deep dive to sort of really look at the archives, probably be using much more detail of the archives out at Berkeley to figure out what exactly was going on at that juncture, because we do know they connected and reconnected. So it'd be interesting to see, you know, one aspect sort of as a test case. The scientist in me would like to say, okay, let's look at what's happening in Paris, but how do these two men evolve in their sort of mid-career, in their 50s, when they're both engaged in different kinds of projects. And I should have mentioned about the murals, one other just small detail to bear in mind is, you know, again, murals, of course, gave these artists challenges to work much larger and just think of their works in a cityscape or in a bigger space. But Hofmann's quite clear that he also thinks the power of work can also be quite small and quite diminutive. So he mentions going into a place like the Metropolitan Museum and says that, you know, one of the smallest pictures that he felt was the most powerful was a work by Ryder. So thank you. Now, sorry, I'm going to come right up to the top there and ask if you don't mind repeating your question, and thank you for being patient. We have time. We're in good shape. We left 15 minutes for you all to ask questions.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a little more about his early life in Germany, and if you had a little more information about that. It seems like I read somewhere that he actually was a trained scientist and an inventor and had patented various inventions in Germany before he took up art.
Well, you probably are way ahead of me because I unfortunately didn't have too much time to get involved in his formative life. But yes, I believe that's correct. I'm thinking about the catalog of the recent works on paper. And I do think what's fascinating about many of these artists that were able to really engage with the materials, I think that's what also makes them quite conscious of using in the sort of effects of the different kinds of materials. So I'm afraid I don't specifically I have his life as you see it laid out there, so I can't corroborate. I'd have to come back on Thursday and really work on that for you, but I'm glad you're using that as part of if you're using it for your tours, because I do think the artist formation is really critical. So I'm sorry I'm less well prepared on the early patents that he had, but I do think it certainly would bear up to be the case. He's very astute when it comes to, as we've looked, his ability to discern what's happening as he's juxtaposing the materiality. And I think that's something also we all tend to forget, you know, that these are actually physical properties of paint, of tempera. He works with tempera as well as oil, you know, as well as paint. And he does describe, and again, that's why I like Elaine de Kooning, because she's giving you the first hand of, you know, he talks about, well, like Pollock, he's often working on the floor. And he says, well, that's because I can control what he calls the runners and the way his pigment is moving. If he's using water and pen and ink and sort of brush, he can control it a little more. So again, they're all trying to get at a modern statement, and the more I guess factors and knowledge they can bring to bear on it, like these former explorations, scientifically, the better. So thank you for that, and we'll talk later. Anybody else? Have we got? Yes, back there. Sure.
What was the name of Elaine de Kooning's book again?
Oh, yes, it's right here. What it is it's republishing. It's called The Spirit of Abstract Expressionism, and I'll try to remember to add it to the handout for the Thursday group. What it is it really compiles the essays she wrote for Hess, the editor of Art News, about different artists. So she'll go through a number of the artists on view upstairs, Hans Hofmann, Andrew Wyeth, Albers, Gorky, David Smith, Renoir, Stuart Davis, Franz Kline, you know, and many of these were colleagues. Jackson Pollock, painting a portrait of the president. She, of course, had painted John F. Kennedy many times, and there are pictures of that. De Kooning memories, and Peter Busa, whom I failed to mention, but also worked out in Provincetown with Hans Hofmann, so he's another member of the group. Any others? Well, I welcome you into the galleries of the Level 3 galleries, and of course all the galleries of Art of the Americas Wing and the rest of the MFA, and thank you for really thinking through this morning with us Hans Hofmann and his many contributions. It's been great to have you.